It's always a bit of a challenge to know where to start in 45 minutes to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour of looking after your emotional well-being, because I'm very aware that all of you will be at very different points in your journey with MEN. Some of you will be quite newly diagnosed, some of you will be living with it for a very long time, some of you will be living within a family setup, some of you will be living on your own. So there's a lot of variation. That's over and above the variation that you have in living with what your condition is like, which, as we know, comes out very differently at different times depending on who you are. So there is a lot in the pot, I think we're saying. So I thought what I would do is, particularly as we are after lunch, try and give you some sort of digestible principles, really, of things that might be helpful in terms of looking after your emotional well-being. So I won't be asking you to work too hard yourselves. You can sit back and just absorb. My hope is that some of this that I'm talking to you about, you'll be going, oh yeah, I get this, I do this already, go me. Other bits you might think, oh, that's interesting, I never thought of it quite like that before. So my hope is there's going to be a little bit for everyone in all of this. If we've got time, I'm also going to talk to you a little bit just to sort of make note of, if you're in a couple relationship, what it's like to be living with someone who has MEN or doesn't have MEN, what it might be like supporting your children with MEN, and what it's like supporting your teenagers with MEN, and those without it too, because lots gets stirred up when one of you in the family is living with this. So I'll start at basics really. We know that life is busy enough, and when you're living with a condition like MEN, it adds another dimension with its own challenges. And I might feel like I'm stating the obvious there, but often when I talk to people over the counselling helpline or face-to-face, one of the things that, in my experience, people often go through a bit of a journey with is feeling that when you're first diagnosed, you can often feel, okay, I know what's happening now, and it's not going to affect my life really, I'm going to plough on. And someone described it to me quite interestingly recently, which was about thinking that they thought of it a bit like having MEN was a bit like when you first find out you might be pregnant. You sort of go through the stage of going, it's not going to affect my life, I'm just going to get on with things and it's just going to come along with me. And then the reality of your baby arrives, or the reality of living with MEN arrives, and you realise it's not necessarily that straightforward. Some of you will have a lot of paraphernalia that you need to cart around, medications, stuff, things to remember, that it might start to be problematic at times that really aren't convenient and you just want to forget about it and ignore it. So part of the process of living with MEN is about trying to find its place in your life, where it's neither everything and you're terribly preoccupied with it, but it's also not nothing, not something you're trying to ignore. So, really, living with MEN affects you, as we know, physically, in terms of how tired you might feel sometimes, in terms of how preoccupied you might feel. There might be other times when it's not really affecting you at all. I think you were saying, Emily, you have times when it's very much in focus for you, and other times where it's much more receded. Now, in a funny sort of way, that means you have to be quite flexible, and that can take energy too, moving from one sort of frame of mind to another frame of mind. It affects you very practically. One of the things that can feel quite difficult, particularly when you're quite first diagnosed and you start having medication that you have to keep on top of, it's just a pain. And sometimes you need to be able to moan about the fact that it's a pain. Medication can be great, can keep you going, but also it's the constant hassle of having to remember to go for scans. When is my next appointment? How am I going to organise that? Do I need to take time off work? Is someone coming with me? Are they not coming with me? It's practically, it can be disruptive. Emotionally, we can talk about a bit more in a minute. And it also affects your relationships. One of the things that I'm quite keen on communicating to you is that when you have MEN in your family, it doesn't just affect, as you all know, you as the individual. It has a ripple out effect where it affects everyone you live with. So if you're living with MEN, if you've got it yourself, everyone's living with it in different ways and will have their own perspectives. The other thing when I was doing a bit of research on this is that it was quite heartening to find that although there's not been much specific research done on MEN, most people, if we think of MEN as a chronic ongoing disease, most people with a chronic ongoing disease adapt really well. It's actually quite optimistic. And some of the really interesting research that's been coming out is that after a period of time, people say, you know, it's a bit odd, I wouldn't choose to have this, but actually it's made me look at my life slightly differently. I appreciate things in perhaps a way that I didn't do before. I've got a perspective on things where some things actually I used to get really stressed about. Now I don't bother. It's a different perspective on life. In a funny sort of way, can be sort of quite liberating. So it is possible to get there. Okay, so I've blatantly plagiarised this title from a book, which I'm sure Jo will cover me in if there's any problem with that. You might be aware there's a self-help book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Do any of you know that? Have you come across it? Good, so you know what I'm talking about. So what I thought it would be good to do is just give you some principles of things that you might be able to build into your life about how to live well, how to live effectively with MEN. The first one is self-awareness, and I think this is absolutely crucial for you living with an endocrine condition, because we are so intrinsically linked in mind and body. And one of the most helpful things that you can do as you live with MEN is to start the ability to sort of discern whether what you're feeling might be physiologically driven. Is this a hormone thing? Is this coming from something going on down here? Or if I'm feeling anxious, is it because of the circumstances of my life at this particular time? Something that's happening that I might be feeling anxious or stressed about. So it's learning how to interpret the things that are going on in your body. Is it an emotional thing or is it a physiological thing? Practical self-care, again, this is something that it sounds a very ordinary thing to be saying to you, but it's something that we can so easily forget. That when you're living with a chronic condition, a proportion of your coping resources are already taken up with just the fact of living with that condition. A proportion of your emotional energy goes into just managing the fact of living with it. So it means that proportionally, in a way, whatever else you pour into that pot, life stuff, relationships, work, Christmas, you know, all these things can build up. So I often say to people, keep an eye on where your levels are at, because remember that your coping strategies will be affected in terms of how much of your coping resources are taken up with living with MEN. Acknowledging and allowing difficult feelings, and this is often one of the biggest challenges of living with a condition like this, is that it stirs up a lot of feelings that we don't necessarily find it very easy to talk about on a day-to-day. We've just brought out a new leaflet you've probably seen on dealing with diagnosis, but probably all of you might be familiar with a mix of feelings that you felt when you were first diagnosed. Perhaps relief on one hand, perhaps worry on the other, anxiety about what it would mean for the future. How's it going to impact your family? When you've been living with it for a long time, sometimes you can get a little bit sideswiped by thinking, I know how to do this. I've been living with this for ages. This is fine. And then out of the blue, you might have a rush of feelings of resentment or anger, or that feeling of it's not fair. I don't want this. And it's really important to allow those feelings to happen, because if we don't, sometimes they can go back into our bodies and we start to feel, you know, achy or headachy or upset in different ways. So finding ways of letting feelings be is really helpful. Learning about your condition, and this kept coming up again and again and again in the things that I was reading about how to cope well with a chronic condition. And it's why days like today are so important. And by coming today, you're already doing something really, really important for yourselves, which is learning to feel more in control, to make choices about your condition, to work with your team, which is my next point. And working well with your medical team is a really intrinsic factor in how well you feel you're living with your condition, both physically and emotionally. And I wasn't quite sure how to put this one, but I found myself thinking of Amend as a bit of a tribe, and that actually hanging out with people who are going through something similar is really helpful, because we all do this under different situations. Even if we're not doing it consciously, we're sort of going, oh yeah, so how do you do that thing then? And so when that happened to you, what did you do? And it helps us make choices. It helps us go, oh yeah, I'm okay, they did that too, we're fine. It really helps us learn how to manage it in a different way. And the other thing that I find myself talking a lot to people about on the phone is we're not always very good at helping others to help us. We want them to know. It goes back to something really early in us. We want someone to know how to respond to us. But we usually can't read each other's minds. And part of living with a condition like MEN, actually I think, is sometimes about learning to be more assertive about what you need and what you want from other people. We'll come to that a bit later on. Okay, so self-awareness, back to this again. This is so crucial. You know for yourselves, if you're feeling anxious about something, you might get all sorts of symptoms, tummy aches, feeling a bit sicky or a bit headachy. If you've got a condition like MEN, that creates an interesting dialogue in yourself. Is this a physiological thing? Have I got something going on with my hormones, with my glands, with my levels? Is that what's going on? Or is this something to do with how I'm feeling about living with my condition? Or is it something to do with what I'm feeling over there? Because I don't know about you, but often when you're first diagnosed, it's very hard to sift through whether you can put everything down to your condition or whether it's to do with other stuff. Does that make sense to you? Have you had that experience yourselves of, you know, is it MEN or is it something else? And it's hard to know, but hopefully you can become more expert over time just by asking the question of yourself. So, to paraphrase that, why might I be feeling this? Is this an emotionally driven thing? Is it a physiologically driven thing? Or is it a combination of the two? One of the other things that often I find myself talking to you about, if I speak to you over the phone individually, is how important it is to accept limitations. And we sort of militate against that. We often don't like to think that we've got limitations. But actually, when we accept the fact that we have, and we do, sometimes that can be very freeing. You are living with a chronic condition that at times will impact your capacity to do things in certain ways. You might be recovering post-operatively. You might be adjusting to something that's going on internally, managing a different sort of medication. There might be times in your life when you're dealing with other stresses. So sometimes I'll spend a lot of time working with people to think through what can you actually manage right now and what's too much. What can you say no to? What can you let go of? Because we can't all do everything all the time, even though we'd really like to, because we can burn out. So knowing sometimes when to step back and when to push yourself is very key. This sounds a really obvious one as well, and I don't want to sort of sound like, you know, your mum here, but eating well with an endocrine condition makes a big impact on your mood as well. You'll know that if you're someone who has, you know, blood sugar level swings, you can feel much more shaky, much more anxious, a bit low. And there's a lot of research being done on how food, even if you don't have a condition like this, can really affect your mood. I quite often work in a university setting, and one of the things that we try and really bang on to students is about how trying to eat well, even though you're a student, can make a really big difference to you in terms of your mood and how you feel in yourself. I'm not telling you anything you don't know there. Exercise when you can. We know that when we exercise, we get those endorphins that are released that make us feel better. We feel better about our bodies. And it's also really important because it reminds you that your body actually does stuff when you want it to, how you want it to. Because sometimes when you've got things going on in the inside, you can feel a little bit out of control. Just reminding yourself that actually my body's all right. It's doing things okay. You know, it's quite being able to go skiing after you've had your op. I imagine that was quite a liberating experience. Think, actually, I've been through all that, but hey, look, my body's okay. It's working. It's doing its thing. Make time for fun, and I say that because there are times when you can be really focused and preoccupied on dealing with this condition, particularly if you're going through a lot of treatment or you're facing an operation. And when it's in times of intensity, you often really need to consciously give yourself time off. And sometimes I'll say that to people when I'm speaking to them over the phone. You know what? You need to give yourself some time off this condition. You need to go and do something completely different. Just get it out of your head. Do something that's just going to give you another perspective. Remind yourself there's a world out there that isn't preoccupied with this stuff. And congratulate yourself. Some of you who have kids will know that there's the well-worn path of you go to hospital and you have a blood test or you have a bit of treatment, you go for a treat. Some of you know that with your kids? Yeah, it's the well-worn bribe, you know. You have a blood test and then we'll go to Pizza Hut, okay? Do that for yourselves. We're no different. It's not easy going to hospital, whether you're getting test results or whether you're having tests done. I always say, treat yourself afterwards, even if it's something really simple. Go and buy a magazine or decide, you know what, when I get home, I'm having a long hot bath. I'm taking the phone off the hook. I'm doing whatever I want to for me. Because you need to be able to say to yourself, well done, I did that thing today that in an ideal life I wouldn't do. But I did it, and I'm going to say, well done me. Learning to say no. I covered that earlier really, but it's a really important one. When you're living with a condition like this, sometimes you have to be a bit ruthless. Say to someone, you know what, I'd like to be able to do that, but right now I need to look after myself, so I'm going to say no. Okay, so looking after yourself emotionally. Emotional work takes physical energy, and that's something we often forget. If we're dealing with difficult feelings, it's depleting physically. You're doing a big piece of work all the time, even if you're not conscious of it, which is living with the uncertainty of your conditions, because they don't conform to a nice, neat, predictive path. We can't go to our consultants and say, okay, so this is happening now, so when's X going to happen and when's Y going to happen? You have to live with a lot of unpredictability and a lot of uncertainty. And that's a real art. That's a real skill to learn how to sort of bear the uncertainty of that. The other thing that we're very good at, particularly in this country, is about saying we shouldn't feel something. It's silly. It's not okay. I should be over this by now. Why am I feeling like this? I don't want to feel like this. And often I spend time talking to people to say, look, your feelings are what they are. In a way, using the energy to fight them, you could use far more creatively to work with them and work through them so that they feel that they have less of a grip on you. Not everyone finds it easy to talk about what they're feeling, but there are other ways of doing it. You can use music, you can use art. Sometimes I've said to people over the phone, I think what you need to do is you need to go and find a really, really big cushion. And that appointment that you had this morning that was really, really difficult and you wanted to strangle your consultant because he couldn't give you the answer you wanted and was a bit unsympathetic, imagine that pillow with your consultant. Give that a really good, you'll feel better, it's fine. They won't know, it won't affect them, but you need to get out some of that frustration that you feel, because however much we'd like people to be able to respond to us in the way we need, we know it doesn't happen. Okay, I'll talk about this in the next slide, but learning to recognise your own stress signs is also really helpful because, well, I'm going to give you a little test actually in a minute. After this session, I'm going to do a mindfulness session. And have any of you heard of mindfulness? Yeah, you have. Yeah. Has anyone else heard of mindfulness? Okay. It's something that is being increasingly taught, I suppose, in schools, colleges, in the NHS, and it's becoming to be felt to be a really useful technique for, well, actually, I'd say dealing with life. It's a very particular way of thinking, which is about learning to live and take yourself back to the present all the time. Much of what causes us emotional pain in our life is worrying about what might happen or brooding on what has happened. And where mindfulness is incredibly powerful is it takes you back into the present here and now, the present moment. And it's been actually really helpful with some Amend members already about dealing with quite difficult experiences. I was talking to someone the other day who has been having a lot of panic attacks when they have MRIs. They really hate that closed-in feeling. And when we were talking it through, we went through a mindfulness exercise that she could use when she was going for her next scan. And she said it was still hideous, but it wasn't quite as bad. So there's a way in which you can use mindfulness very practically in all sorts of ways. Allowing yourself to seek comfort. And that might sound a strange thing to say, but when we're grown-ups, we're not always very good when we go through unpleasant things about being able to ask someone to say, you know, actually, that was really horrible. And actually, I just need you to be nice to me. I need you to understand. If it's someone you know well, ask them for a hug. If it's someone you feel you can go up to and say, you know what, I had to do this thing today, it was really hard. Can you just say to me, well done, and acknowledge that for me? It can make a really big difference. If you live on your own or you haven't got people that you can easily ask for that, just find ways of doing it for yourself. You know, you've had a difficult day of tests, say, at the hospital. You feel tired and you feel worn out. Go home. Wrap yourself in the nicest blanket you can find. Make yourself a really nice warm drink or a glass of gin or whatever it is that you use to make yourself feel a bit nurtured or a bit comforted, because we still need that. Even when we're grown-ups and we're good at dealing with stuff, we still need to be able to go, you know what, I need a bit of comfort right now. So there's a lot of feelings in the pot when you live with something like MEN, and they won't all get you at the same time. They'll come up at different points, sometimes unbidden. You'll be trogging along for ages thinking, that's all right, I can do this thing. And then all of a sudden you might get sideswiped. You think, you know what, I really don't want this thing. Why have I got it? Why hasn't she got it? It's not fair. I don't want this thing anymore. And, oh, I was meant to be going on holiday on such and such, and now they're telling me that I might need to have an operation. Do I have it afterwards? Do I have it before? It's annoying. It sounds funny to say, but someone laughed when I was talking to them recently because she said, you know what? The most helpful thing you said to me is that it's all right to be just annoyed that I have this condition. Because in an ideal world, you wouldn't want it. It'd be much easier to live without it. But you're having to find ways of doing it, and that takes work. So anger, we've talked about. Unfairness. Envy. Now, that's a really interesting one in terms of how it can sometimes show itself between yourselves in families. It's not, I was talking to someone the other day on the phone who doesn't have MEN themselves, but is their partner does. And one of the things that they were really struggling with was how they felt just a little bit envious that when they go to hospital, they could go and effectively have a rest. And she went, I know it's not like that. I know it's not the case. But she said, it feels like it to me. They get to go and lie in bed for a week, and I have to deal with everything else. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that if you're the one living with MEN, sometimes you look at your partner and you think, you don't have to live with this. You don't have to live with it. It's hard work. I wish I didn't have it. So just be aware of these things. They're very normal feelings. Loss. There's a lot of loss when you live with a condition like this. A loss of being able to rely on your body to do what you want it to, when you want it to. When we're very young, we sort of take our bodies for granted. It's like, yeah, it just does these things, doesn't it? And as you get older, you learn it's not quite that reliable. And if you have a condition like this, one of the things that you have to make an adjustment on in yourselves is, oh, okay, I can trust my body in some ways, I can't trust it in others. And sometimes when you're diagnosed, perhaps in your 20s or 30s, you have to do little adjustments too about what you might be able to do and what you might not be able to do. How does it impact you? It impacts your choices, what sort of life you want to and are going to lead. Sometimes it means loss of actual bits of you, actual bits of your body. And that can be a very interesting sensation too. You know, what have I lost? I used to have a bit there, I don't have it anymore. How do I feel about that? Is that okay? Is it not okay? I'm having to get used to a new sense of myself. Sometimes it can be lonely, although I was talking about this to my children who have MEN, and they were reminding me quite helpfully that actually if you're going to get a condition, getting a rare condition might be quite cool. So I'm offering that up to you as a coping strategy I hadn't thought of before, but I'm passing it on as a freebie from them, that as far as they're concerned, if you've got to have a condition, have a rare one, it's much cooler. But of course the other side of that is that sometimes you spend a lot of time explaining to people what it is you've got. And I know in speaking to a lot of you, one of the things that's really frustrating is having to go through the whole rigmarole of, yeah, I've got this thing, it's called multiple endocrine neoplasia. What, sorry, what? No, it's called multiple endocrine, so you grow you grow tumours? Yeah, no, they're not all cancerous tumours. Oh, because there's not cancer then. Well, not all the time, but it can be. Okay. And then a month later, they'll go, you'll say, yes, I've got to go in for this op. Oh, I thought you'd had that. Yeah, no, I have to have them sometimes regularly. So people aren't very good at taking on board something that's not familiar. And it can be a bit of pain, actually. And it can sometimes make you quite angry, I think, that you have to explain again and again and again the peculiarities of what you've got and the particularities of what you've got. You all laughed when I said that, so I'm guessing you've all had that experience somewhere along the line. Yeah, okay. Okay. And sometimes we can have very strong feelings that result. You know, if you're really struggling with how you are, if your health is really deteriorating or not responding to treatment, sometimes you can feel really low, really quite hopeless, quite despairing. And they can be really tough, really dark times. And when it's like that, all I can do is encourage you to really reach out. Reach out to people who know you, reach out to people in Amend. You're very welcome to ring someone like me. I think part of what Amend is very much about is the feeling that no one should have to struggle with this condition on their own. The other one that is often in the pot is guilt, which again is a funny one, but sometimes as a parent you might look at your children and think, I wish I'd been able to protect them from having that. I wish I hadn't passed it on. Or guilt for the impact on your family that times they have to deal with you not being there, that sometimes you're not as well as you'd like to be. There's a lot of guilt that can get stirred up when you live with a condition. Okay, so I'm going to make you do a bit of work now because I need a drink of water. So I'm going to ask you to be a bit brave and stick your hand up when you recognise these as your stress signs. Because when we need to learn to be able to recognise our stress signs in order to be able to learn how to deal with them. Okay? So I'm guessing the first one's not going to be that unusual for a lot of you. Who, when they're really stressed and really sort of, you know, trying to deal with things, who either wants to sleep all the time or not sleep at all? Yeah. So that's a really good barometer. You've already identified there's a link there for you. Okay. Who does this one? Either wants to eat everything or your appetite just goes. Yeah, yeah. Who wants to eat everything in sight? Who could just like raid, if you could have chocolate on tap, you would. Yeah, yeah. Whose appetite completely goes? Yeah, your appetite completely goes. We often go one way or another. We go a bit to extremes in this. Okay, I'm sure none of you do this one at all. But if any of you wanted to own up to this one, it's a really common one. Yeah, yeah. This is a big one for me. You know, this is how I know I'm stressed, is I start getting really ratty about really little things. Okay? The other one is that it gets hard to switch off or relax. Do some of you have that? You get a bit sort of overworky? Yeah, yeah. Feeling exhausted with not necessarily any good reason, nothing's any different, but something's being carried by your body and you just feel, yeah, there's a lot of you. Feeling preoccupied, and by that I mean that your attention is not, you find yourself forgetting things, you find yourself not quite on the ball, you lose stuff all the time. I know I'm stressed on the basis of the number of times I lose my car keys, my purse and my ID card in that day. And I can almost track it perfectly with my stress levels. Yeah? That relate? Yeah. And other times you might just feel stressed out and overwhelmed. You know, you just feel that, have that feeling of you just can't deal with any more. It's just too much. Feeling out of control, getting very tearful. This is a really interesting and really important one because it goes back to what we were saying about self-awareness. Sometimes our feelings go very much into our bodies. We carry them in a sort of physical way. And if you're living with an endocrine condition that can affect, you know, aches and pains are part of it, it's really important to get to know yourselves to be able to discern, is this an emotional thing? Is this a result of something I'm feeling or something that's going on at an emotional, psychological level? Or is this something that I think is physiological? And it's often not easy to tell, but asking the question is really important. And I was thinking of someone that I was working with recently who was getting terribly agitated about the amount of stomach pain that he was getting and was convinced that this was indicating either a pancreatic or an adrenal problem, that it had to be linked to that. And as we talked over time, it became very clear that actually there were things that were going on in his life that he hadn't quite made the connection, were being located somewhere down here. In a funny sort of way, because that was a familiar place to carry it. He was sort of familiar with the pain down here, but he wasn't so familiar with feeling a kind of more emotional pain. And once we'd made that connection, the stomach aches started to go away. So it can be a really helpful tool for you to work out, where's this coming from? How might you respond? Talk to someone who knows you. It's always going to be our friends and our family that we turn to first when things are tough. Think through practical possibilities. Do I need to step back from something? Do a bit less? Ask for some help? If I've got kids, can I palm them off on someone for a day? Do I need a break? Do I need to take a duvet day off work? Is that possible? You know, look after yourselves. Be quite brutal in that sense. You know, you need to take care of yourselves. You might want to talk to your consultant or your nurse specialist. Just feel them out. I need to talk about this with someone. Is this an emotional thing I'm going through? Is it a physiological thing? What do you think? How shall we approach this? Often we work things out in conversation. You can ring me, you can talk to me. I can be a thinking space. How do we understand how you're feeling at the moment? Have a think about it together. And I know some of you find the Facebook groups really, really helpful, where you can check out things with other people. Have a bit of a think with people online in a very straightforward way. You're already, by coming here, doing something massive for yourselves in learning about your condition. Learning about your condition is one of the key things that they've tracked in terms of looking after yourself and good outcomes in living with this, is learning about it. Knowledge is power. It helps you to feel more in control. And one of my kids said to me recently, yeah, I quite like going to the Amend things, not because I really listen to anything, thanks very much, darling, but actually because I just like looking at other people and knowing they've got what I've got. And there's something about just turning up to something like this and going, yeah, you know what, I've got that too, or, you know, my husband's got it, or my wife's got it, you know, and it's sort of just one of the rather lovely things about getting together is that you're part of something and you sort of feel normal. This is normal in this room. Outside there, it's not normal, and that's so helpful. It also means you can become an active participant on your journey. You need to chip in. Your consultants don't know everything. They know an awful lot, but you need to be able to communicate with them effectively to say, I've had this thought about such and such. Do you think it could be that? You need to be in a dialogue with your consultants. Learning about MEN2 also means that we're able to face fears about what's it going to mean for me. I remember when my children were first diagnosed, I said to Emily earlier on that one of the things that was so helpful for them, my son was in his late teens, was when he went online, the first thing that he found was Emily talking about her condition. And he went, she looks like a real person. And I went, yeah, it doesn't mean you become someone different when you've got this. And he went, no, but I thought it might. I mean, I kind of thought, you know, am I going to become really weird? And he went, but she looks really normal, so that's really helpful. So, you know, he had a particular worry about what it was going to mean to him, that somehow just making a connection to Emily's video really alleviated his anxiety. And we have all sorts of fears that we might be conscious of, not conscious of, come up at different times. Attend the information days. You know, there's all sorts of stuff you find out here that you wouldn't find out otherwise. The little mines of information. Working with your team is, again, one of the most important things. And what I found in talking to people over the phone is that it's a really key predictor of how you're going to feel about living with your condition. If you've got a good relationship with your consultant, you feel safe, you feel understood, you feel they're on the case, you feel they've got you. If your consultant isn't someone you feel you can easily talk to and be open with, sometimes I say to people, I think you need to say that. Say that you're struggling a bit. And if your consultant's worth their salt, they'll want to hear that. It's where I think, if at all possible, it's quite helpful, because you've got such an unusual, difficult condition, to be able to be asked to see the same person, if at all possible, ongoing. Logistics mean it doesn't always work out like that. If you really, really can't get a good relationship with your consultant, I really think it's okay to ask to change. You know, don't put up with something, because one consultant that might be right for one person, their relating style, what they're like, might not be right for you. You have to find someone that you can work with and you can gel with. And again, I know I keep saying this, but I'm so big on this. Reward yourself. Go to hospital, have a treat, yeah? Don't think it's only for the kids, it's for you guys too. Helping others to help you is also a really key part of this, because we're not always very good at communicating what we want and when we want it. And when you've got a condition like this, you have to get better at it, to be honest. Let your family and friends know how you are. You'll know people that are really genuinely interested. Talk to them. Other people you know who aren't really that interested, just bypass. Just let it go. Work out who's going to be there for you and who isn't. Help your employer understand your condition. And again, this is where Amend can be really helpful, because I know some employers are much more sympathetic and much more supportive than others. And you need to know, sometimes you need to know what your rights are. And sometimes you also need to be able to think through how to have a conversation with your employer, how to approach it. Be explicit about what help you do or don't need, and know what people are good for. You know, Auntie Joan may not be someone who's going to sit there and ask you how you're feeling, but she's absolutely fantastic about whipping up a chicken casserole for you the night you get home from hospital, okay? So know in your circle of friends and support work who is good for what. It sounds a funny way of putting it, but we're all good at different things. I've said this already, find your tribe. And in a sense, Amend is your tribe. You know, this is the people who know what you're going through. Even if it's not exactly the same, something about being with other people who are going through something similar is what we naturally gravitate towards. You can find understanding here. And you've got people who bear the difficulties with you. They'll get it. They'll get it in a way that people who aren't living with MEN won't get it. And it's somewhere you can both offer and receive support and advice. It doesn't have to be all one way. If you're further along in your journey, actually it can be really quite empowering to be able to offer that to other people who might be starting out, newly diagnosed. So there's different roles you might take up here at different times. And I've just put there, amend is amend your tribe.